5 seconds to go. Start. This court held that abatement involves the mental process of instigating a person or intentionally aiding a person in doing of a thing. Therefore, without a positive act on the part of the accused to instigate or aid a person in committing suicide, conviction cannot be sustained. This court further observed that the intention of the legislature and the ratio of the cases decided by this court is clear that in order to convict a person under section 306 of IPC, there has to be a clear mens rea to commit the offense. Abatement also requires an active act or direct act which led the deceased to commit suicide, seeing no other option, and that act must have been intended to push the deceased into such a position that he committed suicide. However, this court has cautioned that since each person reacts differently to the same provocation depending on a variety of factors, it is impossible to lay down a straitjacket formula to deal with such cases. Therefore, every such case has to be decided on the basis of its own facts and circumstances. More recently, in the case of Jay Deep Singh and others versus State of Gujarat, this court has relied on SS China Supra to hold that the element of mens rea cannot simply be presumed or inferred. Instead, it must be evident and explicitly discernible. Without this, the foundational requirement for establishing abatement under the law, that is, deliberate and conspicuous intention to provoke or contribute to the act of suicide, would remain unfulfilled. This court observed as follows: for a conviction under section 306 of the IPC, it is a well established legal principle that the presence of clear mens rea, the intention to abet the act, is essential. Mere harassment by itself is not sufficient to find an accused guilty of abetting suicide. The prosecution must demonstrate an active or direct action by the accused that led the deceased to take his/her own life. The element of mens rea cannot simply be presumed or inferred, it must be evident and explicitly discernible. Without this, the foundational requirement for establishing abatement under the law is not satisfied, underscoring the necessity of a deliberate and conspicuous intent to provoke or contribute to the act of suicide. It is therefore evident that the positive act of instigation is a crucial element of abatement. While dealing with an issue of a similar nature, this court, in the case of Ramesh Kumar versus State of Chhattisgarh, laid down the parameters of what would be constituted to be an act of instigation. This court observed as follows: instigation is a goad, urge, forward, provoke, incite, or encourage to do an act. To satisfy the requirement of instigation, though, it is not necessary that actual words must be used to that effect, or what constitutes instigation must necessarily and specifically be suggestive of the consequence. Yet a reasonable certainty to incite the consequence must be capable of being spelt out. The present one is not a case where the accused had, by his acts or omission or by a continued course of conduct, created such circumstances that the deceased was left with no other option except to commit suicide, in which case an instigation may have been inferred. A word uttered in the fit of anger or emotion without intending the consequences to actually follow cannot be said to be instigation. It could thus be seen that this court observed that instigation is to goad, urge forward, provoke, incite, or encourage to do an act. It has been held that in order to satisfy the requirement of instigation, though it is not necessary that actual words must be used to that effect, or what constitutes instigation must necessarily and specifically be suggestive of the consequence. However, a reasonable certainty to incite the consequence must be capable of being spelt out. Applying the law to the facts of the case, this court went on to hold that a word uttered in the fit of anger or emotion without intending the consequences to actually follow cannot be said to be instigation. Relying on the decision in the case of Ramesh Kumar Supra, this court in the case of Uday Singh and others versus State of Haryana observed as follows. In cases of alleged abetment of suicide, there must be a proof of direct or indirect acts of incitement to the commission of suicide. It could hardly be disputed that the question of cause of a suicide, particularly in the context of an offence of abetment of suicide, remains a vexed one, involving multifaceted and complex attributes of human behavior and responses reactions. In the case of accusation for abetment of suicide, the court would be looking for cogent and convincing proof of the acts of incitement to the commission of suicide. In the case of suicide, mere allegation of harassment of the deceased by another person would not suffice unless there be such action on the part of the accused which compels the person to commit suicide, and such an offending action ought to be proximate to the time of occurrence. Whether a person has abetted in the commission of suicide by another or not could only be gathered from the facts and circumstances of each case. For the purpose of finding out if a person has abetted commission of suicide by another, the consideration would be if the accused is guilty of the act of instigation of the act of suicide, as explained and reiterated by this court in the decisions above referred. Instigation means to goad, urge forward, provoke, incite, or encourage to do an act. If the persons who committed suicide had been hypersensitive and the action of the accused is otherwise not ordinarily expected to include a similarly circumstanced person to commit suicide, it may not be safe to hold the accused guilty of abetment of suicide. But on the other hand, if the accused by his acts and by his continuous course of conduct creates a situation which leads the deceased perceiving no other option except to commit suicide, the case may fall within the four corners of section 306 IPC. If the accused plays an active role in tarnishing the self esteem and self respect of the victim, which eventually draws the victim to commit suicide, the accused may be held guilty of abetment of suicide. The question of mens rea on the part of the accused in such cases would be examined with reference to the actual acts and deeds of the accused, and if the acts and deeds are only of such nature where the accused intended nothing more than harassment or snapshot of anger, a particular case may fall short of the offence of abetment of suicide. However, if the accused kept on irritating or annoying the deceased by words or deeds until the deceased reacted or was provoked, a particular case may be that of abetment of suicide. Such being the matter of delicate analysis of human behavior, each case is required to be examined on its own facts. while taking note of all the surrounding factors having bearing on the actions and psyche of the accused and the deceased. Stop.